The air inside the courtroom was thick, the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. Judge Beryl Howell's voice cut through it like steel, cold and final, a threat of sanctions delivered with the full weight of institutional power. For a moment it didn't sound like a warning, it sounded like a verdict. Gasps rose instantly, sharp enough to pierce the marble stillness. A few whispers followed, shuffling like dry leaves. Did she really just do that? Did the judge just move to silence her? The words bounced from bench to bench, filling the chamber with shock. Even those used to the theater of politics could feel that this was different. This was raw. This was dangerous. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. Her name had already become synonymous with composure under fire, the kind of steady dignity that unnerves opponents more than shouting ever could. And here, under the threat of punishment from one of the nation's most powerful judges, she didn't flinch. She didn't scramble. She didn't even blink. Her silence stretched, not empty, but electric. Every second without a response only magnified the stakes. The judge's robes carried authority, but Crockett's stillness carried defiance. And the contrast made the tension unbearable. Cameras zoomed in, pens stopped moving. And even those who wanted her silenced leaned forward, waiting for a crack that never came. The balance of power in that room tilted on an invisible axis. On one side, a judge wielding the blunt force of legal authority. On the other, a congresswoman whose calm threatened to dismantle the very premise of the threat. This was no longer about a sanction. It was about what happens when institutional intimidation collides with unflinching dignity. The silence spoke louder than any outburst. It wasn't submission. It was a challenge, a dare, a refusal to give the threat the satisfaction of fear. Crockett's stillness reminded everyone watching that authority is only as strong as the respect it commands. And as the whispers died down, one thought pulsed through the room like a heartbeat if she chose to respond. The ground beneath this courtroom would shift. But what Crockett did next would leave even the judge speechless. Judge Beryl Howell had built her career on commanding order. For decades, she'd been the embodiment of courtroom discipline, sharp, precise, and unyielding. Her reputation rested on the belief that rules weren't just guidelines, they were the spine of justice. To defy them, in her eyes, was to chip away at the very institution she had sworn to protect. When Howell threatened sanctions, it wasn't just a procedural maneuver. It was her signature brand of authority in action. Swift, stern, and uncompromising. But across from her stood Jasmine Crockett, a figure rising in American politics, not by playing along, but by refusing to bow. Where others met institutional pressure with compromise, Crockett met it with defiance, draped in dignity. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't loud. She simply refused to shrink. That refusal alone was disruptive, a challenge to the old assumption that power could silence truth with a gavel. The chamber understood the stakes instantly. This wasn't a routine clash between judge and congresswoman. This wasn't about an obscure sanction buried in legal codes. This was about something bigger, heavier, more dangerous. It was about who gets to define the boundaries of speech and who gets silenced in the name of order. For Howell, this was about maintaining tradition, the weight of the bench, the certainty that rules would bend others before they broke her authority. For Crockett, it was about survival and representation, the knowledge that voices like hers had been muted for centuries under the guise of procedure. To her, this wasn't order. This was erasure, dressed up in formality. As the silence lingered, the room itself seemed to split. Some leaned toward Howell, nodding in approval as if comforted by the rigid promise of control. Others leaned toward Crockett, sensing something deeper in her stillness, something that pulsed with quiet rebellion. The tension wasn't just in the words exchanged. It was in the meaning behind them. Because at its core, this confrontation wasn't really about sanctions. It was about narrative who controlled the story that would be written into the record. Was it the story of a judge keeping order against a disruptive politician? Or was it the story of a woman refusing to be silenced by the very system designed to suppress her? Each passing second raised the stakes. This was faith in institutions clashing with faith in dignity. This was the old guard clashing with the new. And as the cameras captured every flicker of expression, it became clear that the true verdict would not be delivered by Howell alone. It would be rendered in the court of public opinion. In the millions of homes where people watched and waited to see who would yield, the chamber braced, breath held, because everyone sensed it. Crockett wasn't about to let silence be written into the record. Judge Beryl Howell had long been regarded as one of the most commanding figures in the American judiciary. For years, she stood at the center of high-stakes cases where chaos threatened to overwhelm order. To many, she was the iron backbone of the bench, respected, feared, even admired for her unwillingness to bend under pressure. Colleagues called her the guardian of decorum, a judge who made it clear that her courtroom was not a place for theatrics, but for obedience. Her reputation was carved through rulings that were tough, often uncompromising. Lawyers who dared cross her discovered quickly that Howell's patience had limits, and those limits were sharp. When she spoke, her tone carried the weight of finality, as if she alone held the authority to define what justice looked like in that moment. Some praised her firmness as the necessary glue holding fragile proceedings together. Others whispered that her sternness was something closer to arrogance, a refusal to admit that authority could be questioned. Her robe became more than a garment. It was her armor. It wasn't just black cloth draped across her shoulders. It was the uniform of control, the shield she wielded against defiance. Behind that robe, Howell projected a presence of unassailable power. Her gavel, once raised, was more than a symbol. It was a hammer of discipline meant to silence, to remind all present that this was her domain, and her word would always be the final one. Yet her history carried shadows. There were rulings where her rigid adherence to order overrode compassion, where critics argued she valued decorum more than dignity. In moments where voices demanded space to be heard, Howell had been known to cut them down. Wielding precedent and procedure as her weapons, those who opposed her described her as a judge who saw challenges not as part of the democratic process, but as personal affronts. This persona, part guardian, part enforcer, had served her well. For decades, no one had truly managed to pierce the aura she constructed. She projected herself as untouchable, a figure who operated above the fray, immune to the petty passions that roiled in the chambers she presided over. But beneath the steel exterior was a pattern: disdain for challengers, dismissal of dissent, and an expectation that silence would always follow her sternest warnings. And that expectation had calcified into certainty. Howell had come to believe that the strike of her gavel could end any resistance, that intimidation dressed in legal authority was enough to keep order intact. She thrived in the assumption that when she raised her voice, others would lower theirs. That was how she maintained control, through the quiet coercion of fear cloaked in ritual. But therein lay her fragility. Authority wielded as absolute leaves little room for humility. And absolute authority has always carried with it a fatal flaw: the belief that no one will ever dare resist it. Howell's strength was also her weakness. Her rigidity, her reliance on power unchallenged, made her vulnerable to the rare figure who would not be cowed. She had weathered critics before: journalists, activists, even lawyers who muttered under their breath about her severity. Yet none of them stood in her chamber with the same presence, the same refusal to bend, as Jasmine Crockett. Howell had faced dissent, but rarely defiance wrapped in calm, deliberate dignity. That was different. That was dangerous. Her history, her persona, her very identity as the guardian of decorum had prepared her to silence nearly anyone. But the more she leaned on that authority, the more brittle it became. What was once her greatest weapon, the certainty that people would flinch under her gavel, was about to be tested in a way it never had before. Because even the gavel's strike can falter when someone refuses to bow. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the grandeur of marble courtrooms or the prestige of Capitol Hill. It begins in Texas, in communities where opportunity was unevenly distributed and justice often felt like a distant promise. From the start, she understood that the fight for dignity was not theoretical. It was daily, personal, and relentless. As a young attorney, she chose the cases others ignored, defending those who were too often silenced or brushed aside. She stepped into courtrooms where her clients faced systemic bias, and instead of shrinking, she sharpened. Each injustice she encountered hardened her resolve and honed her skill. But her armor wasn't forged from ambition alone. It came from deeper places, faith instilled by her family, lessons of resilience whispered in pews and living rooms, the belief that every trial could be endured if met with dignity. Her community taught her that strength was not about how loud you could shout, but how firmly you could stand when others tried to knock you down. Family, faith, and the expectation that she would carry not just her own voice, but the voices of many became the foundation she built upon. When she entered politics, Crockett did so not as someone eager for titles, but as someone unwilling to watch silence prevail. Her rise to Congress wasn't the story of someone groomed by powerful insiders. It was the journey of a disruptor who carried the weight of marginalized voices into halls that had too often ignored them. In committee hearings and debates, she did not adopt the polished evasions of career politicians. She spoke plainly, precisely, and with the unshakable composure of someone who had argued in courtrooms where lives, not reputations, were on the line. That reputation, sharp, precise, fearless, quickly distinguished her. She earned respect not because she wielded aggression, but because she mastered composure. Where others erupted, she dissected. Where opponents sought to provoke her into missteps, she answered with clarity that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. To her supporters, she became not just a representative, but a symbol of survival turned into strength. Every time she stood her ground, they saw their own struggles reflected in her resilience. What made her different from so many others in Washington was not just her ability to endure hostility, but the way she transformed it. To Crockett, disrespect was not a wall. It was fuel. Every attempt to diminish her became another opportunity to reveal the fragility of her opponents. She had been underestimated too many times to count, and every time, her silence, her precision, her calm dismantled those who mistook composure for weakness. And this is where her lived experience mattered most. Because when Judge Howell's cold threat of sanctions echoed across the chamber, Crockett did not face it as a mere procedural reprimand. She recognized it for what it was: another attempt to weaponize authority against someone who refused to bow. She had seen this dynamic before: judges, officials, power brokers, all trying to silence those who challenged the established order. And she had learned, through trial and fire, that the only response was unflinching resilience. Her life had prepared her for that exact moment. The Texas attorney who once faced biased systems on behalf of her clients, the Congresswoman who absorbed venom from critics and replied with razor-sharp calm, the daughter and community member who carried with her the lessons of dignity, faith, and justice. Every step of her journey had been shaping her into the figure who could stand against the cold authority of a federal judge, not by shouting, not by flinching, but by holding her ground until authority itself trembled. For Crockett, this was never just about her name in the record or her seat in Congress. It was about something larger: the right of marginalized voices to not be erased when institutions tried to impose silence. Her story was living proof that survival could be weaponized into strength. A lived truth could disarm arrogance cloaked in authority. And so, when Howell's stare fell upon her with the weight of sanctions, Crockett did not shrink. She was prepared, not because she anticipated this exact moment, but because her entire life had been training her for it. She knew that when you face the full weight of power bearing down on you, the most devastating response is not rage, not surrender, but resilience. And now, that resilience would be tested under the cold stare of a federal judge. The silence was suffocating. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her voice slicing through the air with authority. "Order must be maintained," she declared, each syllable landing like a hammer on steel. The gavel in her hand was no longer just a tool of procedure, it was a weapon. A reminder that in this chamber, she was accustomed to absolute control. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her eyes locked on the judge with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. She didn't fidget, didn't flinch, didn't allow even the flicker of a reaction to betray her. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like surrender. But to those who knew her, The stillness carried weight. It was the silence of a storm gathering strength. Whispers rippled across the gallery. Some observers nodded along with Howell, affirming her role as the guardian of decorum. To them, Crockett's refusal to respond was confirmation that the judge's authority remained unshaken. But others, the ones who leaned forward, eyes narrowed in anticipation, sensed something else. They saw that Crockett's silence wasn't retreat. It was resistance, deliberate and sharp. Howell, however, grew more assured with each passing second. She mistook Crockett's silence as weakness, as submission. Her voice rose, layered with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. "This court will not be undermined by theatrics or defiance," she continued, her tone icy. "If necessary, sanctions will be imposed. The record will reflect order." The phrase landed heavily. The record will reflect order. It was a statement that sounded procedural on the surface, but everyone in that chamber heard the subtext. This wasn't about paperwork. This was about narrative, about control, about whose voice would be remembered and whose would be erased. Crockett's gaze never wavered. The steadiness of her eyes was beginning to draw attention. Even those who sided with Howell couldn't help but feel an unsettling shift. The longer Crockett sat in silence, the more the balance of the room seemed to change. What had started as a display of judicial dominance began to resemble something else. Overreach. Tension coiled tighter. The silence no longer felt like surrender. It felt like defiance. And Howell, perhaps sensing that the ground was shifting, pressed harder. "You will answer this court," she demanded. "Failure to comply will not be tolerated. Order must be maintained." The words echoed, but the force behind them began to ring hollow. The courtroom, once firmly under Howell's command, was now split down the middle. Half the room heard law and procedure. The other half heard intimidation, a judge wielding authority like a club. Crockett still said nothing. The silence stretched on, unbearably long, and then something strange began to happen. Howell's confidence, so assured just minutes earlier, began to fray at the edges. Her insistence grew louder, sharper, almost desperate, a paradox for someone who prided herself on control. Every word that left her lips seemed to tighten the rope she was unknowingly binding herself with. Spectators exchanged glances. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, others shook their heads. The energy in the chamber was no longer under Howell's command. It hung, suspended, waiting, and all of it centered on Crockett, silent, steady, unbroken. The irony was inescapable. Howell had tried to silence her, to force her into submission, but in refusing to speak, Crockett had taken control of the room. Each second of silence became louder than the judge's declarations. Each calm breath exposed Howell's rising desperation. And then, just as Howell prepared to strike again with words sharpened by impatience, Crockett moved. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward. Her eyes, unwavering, carried the kind of clarity that could pierce stone. The room leaned with her, breath caught in collective anticipation. The judge stopped mid-thought. For the first time, her authority hung suspended in mid-air, waiting for what would come next. Then, with timing sharper than a gavel strike, Crockett finally spoke. The silence had stretched so long that it seemed the walls themselves were listening. And then, finally, Jasmine Crockett broke it not with fury. Not with trembling defense, but with a calmness so sharp it cut deeper than any shout. "Your Honor," she began, her voice low, deliberate, carrying through the chamber with unshakable clarity. "You remind this court that order must be maintained." "But order," she paused, letting the word linger like a weight, "is not the same as silence. And respect is not the same as submission." A ripple ran through the gallery. It was the first time Crockett had spoken since Howell's threat, and already her tone reframed the entire moment. No anger, no theatrics, just precise, controlled authority. She continued, "Precedent reminds us, in Bridges v. California, that the judiciary is not above scrutiny, nor can it punish expression simply because it challenges the comfort of the court. Sanctions are not weapons. They are safeguards. And the safeguard here is not for my voice to be diminished, but for truth to be protected. Howell stiffened at the mention of precedent. For decades, she had wielded her robe as a shield of absolute authority. To hear her own language, the language of Laura directed with such precision, was jarring. Crockett leaned in further, eyes never leaving the bench. If the record is to reflect anything today, let it reflect this, that the purpose of this court is not to erase the inconvenient, but to preserve the just. I have stood in courtrooms where my very presence was treated as disruption. I will not let that history repeat itself, not here, not now, not in the shadow of this gavel. A hush fell so deep that every word landed like thunder. Crockett's pauses weren't empty. They were deliberate, the kind of silences that made people lean forward instead of turn away. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. Authority radiated not from volume, but from certainty. Howell, sensing the grip on her own authority slipping, interjected sharply. This court does not entertain speeches. You will answer directly or risk sanctions. But Crockett did not flinch. She did not back down. Instead, she pivoted seamlessly. I am answering directly, Your Honor. To silence my reasoning is to silence the law itself. Because what you call a speech is what precedent calls an argumentand. Arguments are the lifeblood of justice. Gasps fluttered across the chamber. Howell's attempt to cut her off had backfired. Crockett's words not only reclaimed the interruption, they elevated her position. Crockett pressed forward, her cadence deliberate, her words chosen like scalpel strokes. You see, the authority of this bench does not lie in fear. It lies in fairness. The gavel is not meant to intimidate those who stand before it. It is meant to ensure that truth can be heard. In truth, Your Honor, is not always convenient. Howell's composure began to crack, if only slightly. A tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the eyes. For a judge renowned for her ironclad presence, even the smallest fissure was seismic. Crockett allowed herself the smallest of pauses before delivering her next line. Order cannot mean obedience to power at the expense of justice. If it does, then the record will not reflect will reflect tyranny. The words landed with devastating clarity. The courtroom was no longer watching a judge command silence. It was watching a Congresswoman redefine what justice meant in real time. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone felt it. Howell tried again to reassert control, raising her voice this time. This chamber will not be turned into a stage, but Crockett cut cleanly across her. Not with aggression, but with surgical precision. Respectfully, Your Honor, this chamber is always a stage. Every ruling, every sanction, every silence imposed, these are performances that shape the lives of millions who may never set foot in this room. If truth is silenced here, it is silenced everywhere. The judge froze. She couldn't gavel over that. To do so would only confirm the very point Crockett was making. And so Crockett continued, her words flowing steady, deliberate, unstoppable. She reframed faith in law as she had reframed faith in her own life, not as rigid dogma, but as a living promise of justice. She invoked the Constitution, cases where dissent had been punished only to later be vindicated. Moments in history where authority tried to muzzle change and failed. Every citation, every pause, was another brick in the wall she was building, except this wall didn't exclude. It protected. It uplifted. It dignified. The courtroom was transfixed. Even those who had nodded along with Howell earlier were now silent, caught in the gravitational pull of Crockett's command. It wasn't just what she was saying, it was how she was saying. It calm, certain, absolute. And then she delivered the line that flipped the narrative entirely. Her voice softened, but it carried farther than ever. If the record is to speak, let it speak truth. Not the truth of who holds the gavel, but the truth of why we are here. And let it be remembered, justice is not maintained by silencing the brave, but by amplifying them. The words hung in the air, heavy as lead, yet soaring like a hymn. Howell's gavel resting in her hand seemed suddenly smaller, less absolute. The courtroom was stunned into silence. Howell's control, once unquestionable, now looked fragile, fractured, exposed. And Crockett leaned back, calm once again, her silence now transformed from resistance into triumph. The battle had been won, in words not shouted, not screamed, but delivered with such precision that the walls of authority themselves seemed to tremble. But as powerful as the moment was inside that courtroom, what came next would prove even bigger, because the true explosion wasn't in the chamber. It was everywhere else. The courtroom emptied, but the echoes of Crockett's words were just beginning to reverberate. Within minutes, the moment had leapt from the hushed chamber to the glowing screens of millions. Clips ripped from live streams and phone recordings were spreading faster than any gavel could strike. On Twitter, hashtags surged with ferocity. Hashtag Crockett Court. Hashtag Unbowed. Hashtag Justice Speaks. Each one pulsed with energy, attached to video snippets replayed over and over. Some froze on the line about tyranny. Others looped the moment. Howell's face tightened when Crockett invoked precedent. One edit, punctuated with bass drops, declared in neon text, "Order is not silence." TikTok, ever ruthless in turning politics into viral theater, did not disappoint. Within hours, creators were layering Crockett's calm rebuttal over cinematic music, splicing in images of historic figures who had stood defiant in courtrooms before. One viral remix cut between her words and archival footage of civil rights leaders, framing Crockett as part of a lineage of unflinching truth-tellers. The caption read, "History repeats, but this time she's ready." Memes exploded too. Howell's stern glare was pasted onto cartoon judges banging gavels, always interrupted by Crockett's words mid-strike. A looping gif spread like wildfire, Howell raising her hand to silence.
"Only for Crockett's."
Caption asterisk. Justice is not maintained by silencing the brave asterisk to appear in bold letters across the frame. Newsrooms were scrambling to keep up. Conservative outlets pounced first, decrying Crockett as disrespectful, accusing her of eroding judicial decorum. "A dangerous precedent," one commentator declared. "When elected officials forget their place in front of the bench," but progressive voices framed it differently. "What we witnessed was not chaos," argued one anchor. "It was clarity, a reminder that authority must answer to truth, not the other way around." Editorials compared Crockett's composure to a masterclass in constitutional courage. Faith leaders entered the fray. And here the split was striking. Some traditionalists echoed Howell, warning that reverence for the bench was a sacred civic value. Yet others praised Crockett for embodying the deeper moral call of faith. Justice above ritual, compassion above order. One reverend tweeted, "The prophets were always accused of disrespecting authority. That's how you know they were speaking truth." Even legal scholars couldn't resist weighing in. Law professors dissected Crockett's references to Bridges v. California, praising the precision of her argument. A Yale scholar noted, "It was not a speech, it was a legal scalpel." Howell underestimated her, and it showed. A Harvard colleague shot back, "But courts require decorum. If we normalize this, what happens when demagogues abuse it?" The clash was no longer confined to Howell, and Crockett was now a national conversation about the very boundaries of justice. Howell, respect, and resistance. And still, the people kept posting. A viral thread told the story of a young law student who said Crockett's words convinced her not to quit school. "For the first time," she wrote, "I saw someone who looked like me refuse to be silenced in a courtroom. That's the lawyer I want to be." Thousands liked, retweeted, and commented, echoing, "Same, it wasn't just social media." Late-night hosts joined in, too. One played the clip, then quipped, when the judge reached for the gavel. Crockett basically said, "Keep it, I've got the Constitution right here." The audience roared. Another compared Howell's silence after Crockett's last line to a buffering wheel that never loads. The ripple effect was undeniable. For supporters, Crockett's composure became a rallying cry, proof that dignity could dismantle arrogance. For critics, it was a nightmare scenario, an elected official challenging judicial authority on record and winning the court of public opinion. But as the dust of memes takes and hashtags swirled, something deeper was brewing beneath the noise. Beyond the applause, beyond the outrage, Beyond the headlines about decorum versus defiance, a question lingered. It was whispered in legal classrooms, debated in pulpits, mulled over at dinner tables. What do we value more, authority, unchallenged, or truth unshaken? And that was the reckoning no one could scroll past. Because beneath the applause and outrage, a deeper reckoning was beginning. The clamor of hashtags and headlines eventually gave way to something quieter, something heavier. In interviews, on panels, and even in the hallways of Congress, Jasmine Crockett began to reframe what had unfolded, not as a personal clash between herself and Judge Howell, but as something larger, something elemental. Justice, she said in one widely replayed clip, is not about silence. It's about truth. If our courts become places where truth is swallowed for the sake of order, then what exactly are we preserving? Her words struck like a tuning fork, resonating with those who had long felt the weight of silence pressed upon them. For some, Crockett's defiance was validation. For others, it was revelation. In that reframing, the confrontation no longer looked like a breach of decorum. It looked like a breach of chains. The emotional crescendo came in her next line, delivered not with fire, but with the same calm that had carried her through the storm. Dignity, she said softly, triumphs over intimidation. And it was true. Howell had wielded rigidity like a weapon, brandishing her authority as if the gavel could silence not just words, but will itself. Crockett, by contrast, had relied on something quieter, harder to shatter resilience. She did not flinch, she did not break, she did not bow. Where Howell clung to the ritual of control, Crockett embodied the substance of justice. Commentators picked up on the contrast quickly. One headline read, "Robes versus Resolve, Crockett redefines power." Another, "Intimidation meets its match." It was no longer a question of whether. Crockett had disrespected the bench it was whether. The bench had respected the people it claimed to serve. Her message rippled outward. America's future depends not on rigid silence, but on the courage of those who speak when told to stay quiet. It depends on voices like hers, voices that carry not arrogance, but authenticity. Voices that refuse to vanish, even under the cold stare of authority, and that's what unsettled so many. Because if one member of Congress could stand tall before the robe and not falter, what might that inspire in others? Students, advocates, everyday citizens who had always been told to hush, to wait their turn, to respect the process, even when the process disrespected them. Crockett had exposed something fragile.
Ow.
The idea that control equals respect. Her resilience revealed the opposite, that respect is earned, not enforced. She closed one of her speeches with a reminder that echoed through communities across the country. Authority is not absolute, but dignity endures. It was a line destined for posters, TikToks, and hashtags. But more than that, it was destined to settle deep into the bones of those who had watched her in that courtroom. It was a reminder that justice is not fragile, nor is it defined by ritual alone. Justice bends toward the truth, even when a gavel strikes against it. And for millions watching, one piercing question lingered. Who really holds power in America's courts? Asterisk, Judge Beryl Howell tried to sanction. She tried to press silence like a weight, to make an example out of Jasmine Crockett. But Crockett did not bend. She stood firm, steady, unshaken. And in that courtroom, something shifted. America saw more than a legal scuffle. It saw the line between intimidation and integrity. And it watched as dignity prevailed. If you felt that spark of truth, you weren't alone. Across living rooms, classrooms, and timelines, people recognized themselves in Crockett's stance. They saw a reflection of every time they'd been told to stay quiet, every moment they'd been pressed to accept less than justice. And they felt the power of watching someone say, defiantly, no more. That's why this story matters. Not because it was dramatic, though it was. Not because it went viral, though it did. But because it reminded us of something too easily forgotten. Courage has a sound, and it carries farther than any gavel. So if you believe justice should fuel dignified intimidation, this is your moment to lean in. Subscribe, Share this story and join a movement of voices that won't be silenced. Because when we amplify courage, we don't just watch history, we shape it. This wasn't just a clash. It wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a reminder of what America's courage truly sounds like. And it sounds a lot like you.